In 2000, it's an extremely close election. Vice President Al Gore will represent the Democrats. George W. Bush, the son of former President George Bush and governor of Texas, will represent the Republicans. And it's a very, very close race. And the fact that they drug Clinton through the mud, which he had kind of set them up for, may very well have made a difference in some votes. And it's such a close election, there's a good chance that doing that had helped set up a narrow Republican win, and it's extremely narrow. Now, there's one other important candidate here. There's once again a Reform Party / Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader. He doesn't get very many votes, but the tiny number of votes he gets will make a difference. So here's how it breaks down. Gore got 500,000 more votes in the whole country than Bush did. But remember, we use the Electoral College. You have to win state by state and build electoral votes. And in the end, there were several states that had to have recounts because they were so close. And the most important of those, with 25 electoral votes that year, was Florida. Whoever got Florida would be the president. And it came down after a long period of recounting the votes and looking at the ballots to see which hole had they actually punched on some of the ballots that were unclear. It ends up that by just 537 votes, George Bush won Florida. And it's significant because Ralph Nader barely got any votes in Florida, but he got a couple thousand. And when you consider that since he's a Green Party candidate and leans more towards the left, he probably, if people hadn't voted for him, more of them probably would have voted for Gore if they voted. So there's a good chance he tipped the scales in Florida, which was enough to tip the scales nationally. So in an extremely close election, Bush wins. Even though he didn't win the majority vote, he won the Electoral College. And after making the challenges that they could, Al Gore eventually accepts that he has lost, and we continue on with our nation, with George W. Bush as our president. But not too long after George W. Bush becomes president, we face a new challenge. Terrorism had been a threat for a long time, and there were many that did not like the American way of life or the countries and ideologies that we supported. And a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, led by a fellow by the name of Osama bin Laden, had been plotting and planning to try to attack the United States for years. They'd actually made a couple of attempts that had failed. But on September 11th, 2001, they sent terrorists into the United States to learn to fly planes. And they went to flight school. And they learned enough to fly the planes. And literally, they then dropped out before they learned how to land the planes, because they weren't going to land them. And on the morning of September 11th, terrorists boarded 4 flights. And with little bitty tiny razor blades, held them to the neck of a stewardess and took control of the planes, because the protocol during the age of terrorism so far had been cooperate. If you don't, that woman dies. If you cooperate, they fly the plane someplace, they negotiate, and there's a good chance we all walk away. But that's not what these guys have in mind. They take control of the cockpits, lock themselves in, and first they fly one plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York, using it as a bomb, which will cause a huge fire. A few minutes later, they fly a second plane into the other tower. Now, at first, people thought, oh, this is a terrible aviation accident. But when that second plane hit, people knew we were under attack. And 2 more planes had been hijacked. A third plane was flown into Washington, D.C. and hit the Pentagon building. Meanwhile, a 4th flight, Flight 93, flying over Pennsylvania, had been turned around and was heading towards Washington. But by that time, the people on the plane, on cell phones at the back of the plane away from the terrorists, were calling family. And family was telling them what was happening on the ground, that Buildings were being hit, and they knew what they were about to be used for. And so the passengers of Flight 93 storm the cockpit. They take the plane from the terrorist. At least they're able to bring the plane down. They can't save their own lives, but they kept that plane from being used against fellow Americans. Throughout the day, the fires burned and caused structural damage to the World Trade Centers, and they both collapsed. We had come under attack by terrorists. Now, the problem is we didn't know who at first, and we didn't know where. So the United States starts looking for answers, and we determine it was Al-Qaeda, and they are being trained in Afghanistan. Now, recently, we had helped Afghanistan fight to drive the Russians out during the 1980s. But now, one of the groups, the Taliban, a very extreme, strict Islamic sect, had taken control. They're so extreme they make the women wear burqas, completely covering every inch of their bodies. Women have no right to education or drive a car. They're pretty much men's property there. The men are not allowed to shave. They're extreme, and those are just physical representations of the extremely strict society they've created, and they're pro-terrorist. But there were people already in Afghanistan fighting to overthrow them. And so when we find out this government had supported Al-Qaeda, and that Al-Qaeda was there and we needed to go after them, we enter the war. We start supplying the rebels. We help them take down the Taliban government. Then we send in troops, not to win the war. That was already done. They had taken down the Taliban. We send in troops then, no longer to just advise, but now we go hunting and stomping out the terrorists in the backcountry. But it's not quick and it's not easy. And the other goal we have is to give them democracy, to give them a country like we have. And so we do our best to help them form a democracy. And we will be there for 20 years, our longest war. And we will do everything we can to help them form a democracy. And we will do everything we can to crush the Taliban and the terrorists that are in the backcountry. And we'll do a lot to weaken them. But ultimately, as we'll see later, eventually we will come home from Afghanistan. And the changes we tried to make there won't last. And the Taliban eventually will reassert itself and take control. And where it goes in the future, and if any lasting changes, any changes we made there make an impact in the long run, we will see. But ultimately, it becomes our longest war. It's long, it's frustrating. We have a hard time figuring out how to get out of there. But that's not the only war that George W. Bush involves us in. Not only are we going for good reason into Afghanistan to hunt down terrorists who attacked us, but then there's Saddam Hussein back in Iraq, who is still resisting, and we're accusing him of supporting terrorists. And we're accusing him of still having weapons of mass destruction, and he's still being stubborn, and he won't let us in. And so the United States tries to build support, but most of the countries of the world don't think we need to go back in there. So we went in mostly unilaterally with only a few allies. And we go into Iraq. We very quickly overrun his government, drive him from power. He eventually is captured and executed by his own people. And we try to set up a friendly democracy there. But that democracy has some problems because Shia and Sunni Muslims are divided. And civil war breaks out there. And the terrorists see this as an opportunity to start coming into the country where there wasn't really proof they had been there before. Now they are. And eventually we'll see groups like ISIS rise up to spread radical Muslim ideologies and try to create an Islamic state. And so it becomes a battleground where America gets bogged down. And on top of all of these things, the economy is starting to crumble. We enter what's called the Great Recession, where poor investments in the dot-com startups, in savings and loans, and especially giving loans to people that are flipping houses in the real estate market, ends up causing a recession, the Great Recession. And so with the economy starting to struggle, although George W. Bush will make it through 2 terms, we've got challenges. We've got 2 wars that have become kind of a quagmire. We've got an economic recession going. So in 2008, the Democrats put forward two very interesting candidates. The first major party candidate nominee, Barack Obama, and almost winning the nomination, the first woman to almost do that, Hillary Clinton. Ultimately, Obama wins the nomination, and Clinton will eventually serve as his Secretary of State. The Republicans put forward John McCain, a more moderate candidate, as their front runner, and for the first time ever, the Republicans put a woman on the ticket, Sarah Palin, as vice president. Ultimately, Barack Obama wins. He promises to bring change and to fix our problems. And so, as you look into the Obama administration, you're going to see, first of all, a push to create some type of a health care plan. Obamacare will be the big success in many ways for his administration, though even among Democrats it was controversial and quite unwieldy in size. And eventually it will become a political pull toy between the political parties. But we get a national health care bill. We're going to see other changes throughout his administration as he tries to find ways to bring the Great Recession to an end, which ultimately, before his second term is out, it will be coming to an end. We're going to see other social changes as a group called the Tea Party, the Taxed Enough Already Party, rises up. It's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's a fiscal responsibility group that's really unaligned with political parties at first, and it rises as a grassroots movement. Eventually, it will mostly align with the Republican Party and have an influence on future elections. We're also going to see during the Obama administration a change in our national laws about gay marriage. This had been quite a social struggle for a long time, and during Obama's administration, we are going to see the national legalization of gay marriage. So there's a lot of changes happening during Obama's administration. Throughout it all, though, he promised to try to get us out of those wars, but they continue, and we just can't seem to find a way to withdraw. He'll eventually, before he's out of office, start to draw down our troops in Iraq, but he can't quite finish getting everyone out of Afghanistan, and ultimately that will be left for another administration. He also starts trying to negotiate with our longtime enemy Iran, trying to broker a deal with them to ease tensions and to limit their ability to pursue nuclear weapons. And he ends up coming up with a deal with Iran, but that deal will eventually, in the next administration of Donald Trump, be thrown out. So there's a lot of political division still as we enter the 2016 race. And in the midst of all that, we're going to have a new sort of candidate in Donald Trump. He's going to defy political norms. He is going to say things and do things in a way that politicians just didn't typically do. And that's going to speak to a lot of Americans who are sick and tired of business as usual. Hillary Clinton will become the candidate of the Democratic Party, the first woman to gain that, and it looked very much like she would become the first woman president. But ultimately, on Election Day 2016, thanks to the Electoral College, Donald Trump will win. Even though Hillary Clinton won more popular votes, Trump won fairly securely with the states that he won with the electoral votes. And so as you enter the Trump administration, things are going to get very interesting as things are done very differently than they've been done before. And it's at that point that we'll draw a close to this course. I usually don't try to cover the last few presidents because history still hasn't quite made its judgment on what they accomplished and how to view them. So as you look at the next, at this unit, and as you in your life look at the next few presidents after this and the president that you now have, be thinking about how all of these things that have happened before have influenced the country that you live in and the world that we live in. Hopefully you've learned a lot in this course. Hopefully it's made you think a little bit differently about what you know and how it all connects. And I hope you do very well on the finals, so study hard. And congratulations on making it to the end of 1302.